Walaikum salam.
This is the question for Dr. Ipek. First of all, Dr. Ipek, yes, your face reflects God's mercy, beauty, and wisdom, and I can see it. The question is, this is the first time I'm hearing about Gulen and Gulen Movement. I have read about it, but I have not been able to understand Gulen Movement. I have thoroughly read Maulana Rumi, and it seems to me that his message, Gulen's message, is not as different than Maulana Rumi. Question is, if it is different, how different it is? Where are the differences between Gulen and Rumi? The second one is, to take the question further, how Gulen's message is different than grand Sufis such as Abdullah Qadir Jilani, Baghdadi, and Khwaja Muhyiddin Chishti. And I have another question for Dr. Kim later.
Thank you for your question. I think.
Okay, thank you for that. First for the compliment, and secondly for the question. I think that Gulen is not that much different from Rumi. In my knowledge of both of them, I would say they're very similar, but Gulen is, a 21st century Sufi, and so perhaps speaking a little bit differently, but Rumi has a great love for creation and sees God in every creature, and so I can't see that there is much of a difference. In terms of the grand Sufis, I have to admit some ignorance there that I could not compare Gulen with them, so maybe someone who knows more could, but thank you for the question.
Yeah, well, a few words. I think there is a whole debate on the question, is Gulen a Sufi, yes or no? Well, technically, he is not, if you understand a Sufi as someone who believes, who belongs to a specific school, a specific way, a specific tariqa, and also has a specific shaykh or peer who introduces him in the Sufi way. I think the reason why, on the one hand, it is clear in Gulen's works that he works a lot with Sufi notions, and I just talked about that a little bit. But on the other hand, doesn't want to confine himself or doesn't want to be put into the box, so to say, of Sufism, is that, it has many different associations. And even, I think you can read Rumi in very different ways. There are people who read Rumi as a kind of a free thinker who is above all institutional religions. And there are other people who say, no, if you really want to understand Rumi, you really should read him in a Muslim context. And but you could discuss very much the same with Fethullah Gulen as well, I think, because there are people who take his words differently as well. So in that sense, I would say historically there is not a very lot of continuity in Turkey, because the Sufi movements in the founding of the Turkish Republic, the Sufi movements were curtailed and they didn't have much influence in public life. They were not allowed any longer in public life. They lived on in a kind of a private sphere. And nowadays they are revived, although some people ask, okay, is this religious motivation? Well, there is some religious motivation. It has to do with tourism as well, let's be honest. So I think that Gulen refuses to be identified as a Sufi because that would put his whole effort into a clear picture, and I think he doesn't want to fit in any picture, and therefore he would say, well, of course, the Sufi notions are very important to me, and I would personally, as a scholar who did some research on it, I would add that I think you will have to go through some of these basic notions in Sufism to understand what drives his movement, but probably Gulen himself would say, it's not so interested what drives me, it is interesting what we do, and therefore our activism is much more important than these Sufi notions, and therefore he wouldn't want to be identified with the Sufi.
Yes, please, Dr. Kim.
Just one more ad from the Professor Epic and Professor Dean. That's really good advertisement of my upcoming book. And I revised my dissertation, and I'm gonna submit next week to the SUNY Press or Oxford Press. If they accept that, they're gonna publish it. In that dissertation, I argued a lot about if Gulen can be considered a Sufi or not. And what I found in my research is that several scholars right now, they called the Gulen as a contemporary Rumi. So there is certain the connections between Rumi and the Fethullah Gulen. What is the difference? That's what your question, right? What is difference is that first of all, social contexts are different. And Rumi, when the social context that Rumi lived in was so narrow in those contexts. But now we live in the globalized context. So Gulen should address to the globalized humanity, not such the narrow mind in the narrow context. So his approach includes and address to much more people all. So he put more on dialogue in that sense. And he combined not only Gulen's teaching, but also Yunus Emre is the other pillar of Gulen's the approach to Sufism. Is that some clear more? If you are really interested, please wait my upcoming book. And the other sense...
So he's going to keep us on the edge.
In the other sense that Dr. Pim said about the Sufism without the tariqat. That's what I argued, my main argument is that I found that Sufism is really highly misunderstood in contemporary academia and publics. And in Turkish, if you say that I'm a Sufi, the police gonna catch you up into the jail. Because in the modern, with the advent of Atatürk, he abolished all the tariqat movement there. So Sufism equalized with the tariqah, the Sufi orders. So in that context, the Fethullah Gulen himself did not make, that's my argument, my bit, want to clarify his Sufi. But when you read the Sufism in the line of Islamic spirituality, which began with the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it's exactly the same. He is very little talk, little eat, little sleep. That's not Sufi, that's the essence of Sufi. More focus on spiritual life. In that sense, I call him a Sufi for me. Thank you.
Yes, please do. Dr. Stewart.
Just a follow-up on this issue. It's one thing to be informed by Sufism, and clearly he's deeply and genuinely informed by Sufism. But it's another thing to belong to a named category, a social group, and so on. And such, which would suggest, in fact, locate a kind of an exclusiveness that flies in the face of everything that Gulen is talking about. Given his emphasis on action and service, it would be counterproductive, it would be undermining of getting to that effective action and service were he to identify himself exclusively as a Sufi.
Yeah, exclusivism and extremism, marginalization, those kinds of things. Yes, indeed. Do we have another question? Yes, please step to the microphone.
May I ask a question?
Yes, you may.
For Dr. Ward, please, or are we going by individual papers?
You can pose your question as you may, and I thank our panelists, but if you would like specifically for Dr. Valkenburg to answer the question, you may address that question solely to him, and then the other panelists may join in as they shall.
Thank you. My question is about the theme of justice, which I heard repeated a few times in Professor Ward's talk. The word justice, at any rate. I think you were the speaker who emphasized that the most in connection with peace and Gulen's ideas. And of course, justice exists in the Jewish scriptures, and before that in the various codes of justice that people came up with. So I'm curious about the application of Gulen's ideas and the role of justice. For example, in countries with long histories of oppression like South Africa, we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission where all kinds of injustices were exhumed, as it were, and aired, and reconciliation was sought. And Lord knows that in the recent century that there have been injustices galore and crimes. And I'm wondering what the approach would be to reconciliation with reference to these crimes in different regimes and cultures. And I think we know what these all are. Thank you.
Let me give it just a try. It's an interesting and a very provocative question. It seems to me that if I understand Gulen on this, the importance of what I've been labeling as justice is not only a thing that you give somebody, but it's a challenge that you make to the person or to the group. I'm reminded of some years ago when I was doing some work on social capital and civil society initiatives in nearby Bulgaria. And I was talking to some Roma, and I said, how would you like to join in these civil society initiatives? And they said, well, yes, of course we'd like to have a better deal. We'd like to be able to be taken seriously governmentally, economically, and so on. But we got a question. Would we have to reciprocate that? And I said, well, that would be the notion, because by extending you these courtesies and responsibilities and so on, likewise you are responsible to the other. And
yes, it must be bi-directional. Must
right.
be.
Yes, and I'm sad to say that this small group, my little focus group, in fact, declined the offer. They didn't want to go. They had been so, as they understood it, abused for centuries, that one, they found it unlikely that the civil society initiatives were genuine, and therefore they would lay themselves open to more prejudice and so on. But Gulen is nothing if not a great communicator. And part of his communication is not only teaching things, but challenging people and their societies. And that's where the justice plays out, it seems to me.
Yes, and most things, I can tell you from the perspective of a human developmentalist, that our brain tends to see things in two ways. We either see them as a threat, or we see them as a challenge. And I think Dr. Stewart is so correct in that justice and then social justice is something that we can give or convey or bring ourselves to a point at which we begin a very serious dialogue, as Dr. Kim has suggested, but we also must be challenged to step into that space. You know, our brains are, there's a thing that's referred to as plasticity in the human brain. Our brains are changing all the time. We need to take in new thoughts, new ideas, new opinions, and give them due consideration. But in order to do that, we must create the space for it, because it involves risk more times than not. And it's that risk factor. Humans don't like to be put in a place of risk. We either see it as a challenge or we see it as a threat. And I think we now have another question, please.
Thank you. Well, I always like coming to these Gulen conferences, and I've heard a lot of talks and I've read a lot of papers, and you always have this theme about Gulen, love, tolerance, peace. You always leave feeling good, you know, my heart is at peace, all of that good stuff. But I have this question I've been thinking about. We have these competing realities in the world. One is, you know, what the panel just finished talking about, is that Islam is peace, and We know Gulen Movement's goals are peace through dialogue, tolerance, and love. Yet, at the same time, in the world today, is that we have some of the greatest intolerance and violence is being committed by those who claim to be Muslim. And even though moderates far outweigh fundamentalists or terrorists, the view of many non-Muslims and Westerners has been identified in various social research polls, various surveys, is that Islam is an intolerant religion. It's a religion that promotes violence. So my question is, how do we get out of these competing realities?
Of whether Islam is a religion of peace or of war and violence is yes. The point of it is the doors are open for either way. And I think we need to, in this case, be as watchful and as vigilant as we are in other political systems and contexts where you say the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. Likewise, the price of peace and justice and these good things and the good feelings and so on is constantly to be striving. And that's where at least one of the key notions of jihad is this struggle, this striving for these things, and to be ever vigilant when the counterproductive interpretations seem to dominate.
Thank you. Yes.
Just to add to that, I think that we need to educate ourselves and know the facts. And, you know, we all have a responsibility to do that if we want to build peace in the world today. Because certainly, you know, many people do think Islam is a religion of war and not peace. And so know your facts, you know, and be able to educate others. The other thing that I want to speak to is the media, actually. After 9/11, there were hundreds of Muslim organizations that deplored what happened, but the media did not cover that. And they kept saying, you know, people kept saying, well, there are moderate or mainstream Muslims who are not terrorists, you know, but they got no media coverage whatsoever. And, you know, when A Common Word came out in 2007, I looked and looked, you know, in various newspapers on the internet. I mean, I could not find a newspaper that carried this wonderful document in the news that 138 Muslim scholars and clerics had written this letter to Pope Benedict and other religious leaders. However, they did cover the event that sparked that document, which was Pope Benedict's I don't want to say statement, misstatement, or whatever, his statement that Islam was spread by the sword. And so, you know, they covered that, but did not cover the peaceful response from Muslims, only the negative response from some Muslims. So I would say, get a hold of your media, write to the editor, you know, whatever you can do to publish or to write letters. When things like that come up, write letters to the editor, let your voice be heard, be active, be part of that Dar al-Hizmat, the service of, the abode of service. Thank you.
Dr. Kim, would you like to?
I would like, but I have another 10 minutes or in the end, and I was thinking answering a bit longer at that moment and not taking time for our panel right now.
We'll allow Dr. Kim to. Dr. Kim, would you like to make a statement?
From my approach, that this really practical approach to engage dialogue and to spread peace, my approach is we get insight from what the Fethullah Gulen teaches us. Is that that's what Dr. Pim told us, the mindset. I want to use that one if you don't mind. A mindset of to see others as objects of dialogue and love. That's what I wanted to say in relation to my dialogic humanism. And just one brief example to that mindset of dialogic humanism. Think about that. In the very early morning that yesterday I came to the Washington D.C. All of a sudden a man came into my apartment with gun and threatened my wife and my cat. What you gonna do? What you gonna do? And I rushed to my kitchen and take some knife and to defend my wife and me and my cats, right? And eventually, this robber came into my apartment with a mask. Think about it, with a mask. And at some time, I was powerful than him. I got over him. And I took off the mask before I killed him. And I found that he is my brother. What I'm gonna do then? I'm gonna say to him, hey, let's have a cup of coffee. Why did you do like that way? If you think others, like Americans in Afghanistan, American troops in those countries, or Muslim fundamentalists in America, if they see you as one of among us, I mean dialogic, among you, you may want to ready to engage dialogue before you attack. If you see them, do you follow me? But if you see from the beginning, no, this is robber, I have to kill him. That's it. That's what happened here. But if you see, no, I want to see first, who are they? I want to learn first who are they. It's a human being also. Then that's the mindset of.
Could I add just one thing?
Yes, sir.
I'm sensitive to the issue raised by Professor Epling earlier with regard to the culpability of the media, but I think we need to be cautious on that one. Having been quoted, and I thought misquoted many times in the press and so on, found out when I checked the recording, it was my fault, not their fault. In other words, what's necessary is not only the truth in journalism for the media side, but also willingness to engage effectively in the rhetorical aspects of the struggle. And it's more than just a single letter with 135 signatures. It probably requires more adamant testimony and working within their own community and so on. That's true for Christians who are similarly fundamentalists if they are, or violent and so on, as well any other groups.
Thank you so much. Dr. Valkenburg, can you present your statements in maybe 2 minutes? Your closing statements you wanted to make,
sure.
and then I will recap, and we'll be out.
Yeah, the reason that I wanted to talk about it a little bit is people often, well, not often, but sometimes ask me, why do you spend so much time about this Fethullah Gulen and his movement? Isn't it much more interesting to study fundamentalism, and isn't it through studying fundamentalism that we can find solutions? I have a kind of a double answer on that. The first answer is, I think, I cannot combat myself fundamentalists. I can try to understand them. I can to understand, and I think that's what Professor Kim went to talk about as well, to understand why they do what they do. But I think that is still in our intellectual notions. What is more important is, where do you stand in society? Whom do you strengthen and who do you not strengthen? So one of my reasons why I work so much with this movement, like the Rumi Forum and others, is I think they are doing some more marvelous work, and they really deserve our support. So wherever I can, I will do that and say, well, they are the people who build bridges, and we should be very grateful, and we should thank God that it's Muslims who are building bridges, so that the image that it is always the Christians who do that is not true. So that's one point. The second point is educate our youth. So let me this time not quote Fethullah Gulen, but let me quote Ibu Patel, another American Muslim scholar who built the Interfaith Youth Corps in Chicago. When he was a student at college, he observed how some of his friends became fundamentalist type Muslims. And he said, well, it is precisely who gets to their heads first. If it is the people who promote this identity strengthifying message of you have to be a good Muslim and therefore you have to combat others, if you are the first, you get the first chance to get an impression on their mind. Therefore, we should take care that there are more and more young people coming who have a different message. And I think that's important. And again, I'm very happy it's not only Fethullah Gulen, but other Muslims say that as well.
Absolutely. I have been told that we can take one more question, and the lady at the microphone now happens to be in the correct position to do that. We'll give it to the women this time. Sorry, gentlemen. We'll have this one question, and then we will move to recap.
I'd like to, if I may, for a moment, if you'll indulge me, focus on the preventing violence and achieving world peace portion more than the Gulen Movement portion. I deal with 2 young children, 2 girls, and on festive occasions, I do my very best to give them both a present that is equal. While one is older than the other, they may not in fact be appropriate for both of them the same thing, so I try to give them something age appropriate. I've never had peace with that issue, and I think peace begins in the family at home at an early age. And I've yet to create peace around that issue because invariably there's a competition. There's a psychodynamic quality that creates competition in us. While I think we want to be members of a group, we want to be equal members of a group. Not only that, but we want to distinguish ourselves as being better in some aspect, in some quality, in some sphere. And inherent in that is competition, sometimes conflict, sometimes great striving. The woman, the woman in Texas who murdered a neighbor's child because she was about to become a better cheerleader than her own daughter, I think expressed that need, that overwhelming need to be better. I see that being played out between this 10-year-old and this 14-year-old every single holiday, and I haven't solved it yet. The second question, I have 3. The second question is, I think we are not reaching out only to those who are already singing the same song and saying the same words as we are. We have to reach out to others, and not only other monotheistic members, but perhaps atheists as well. And the question is, what kind of language do you use with an atheist when you can't call on God to say, we're all equal in the eyes of God? That isn't going to work. And furthermore, if we've all been created such that we're all different so we can get to know each other better, how do you reconcile those things? And then how do you reconcile the whole issue of competition and nonviolence? Because I think a lot of issues are about competition. Competition for land, competition for supremacy, competition for you be like me, and the fear behind that, the fear of someone being different while we simultaneously seek a variety of perspectives. Thank you. I look forward to your comments.
I would like to start this one, if I may, panelists. As an instructor in a teacher education program, I can tell you that this competition, this idea and notion of competition, is very prevalent in the American school system. I would like to see us move our students and actually this nation and people around the world from being so competitive to being more collaborative. This, however, is being played out in what is now technically in all of the literature is being referred to as bullyation. Bullyation occurs on many levels, and you hit upon a couple of them with your example of your young girls. And the young girls, I will also say, are influenced by the media. But it will, that competition, that level of competition is just so innate to who it is we are as human beings, and we have to supersede that and override that and learn to really recognize the impulse and mechanisms of that, I think. And the second point that I will make, and I'm going to turn it over to our panelists here, the second point that I would like to say is there is no such thing, I don't think in my mind, as a true atheist. Because one had to at least believe in a God in order to determine that now there is no God. Panelists?
I was fascinated with the question with regard to how do you deal with somebody like an atheist and some. I don't know whether Gulen is, and I could use some help here, if he's addressed it and so on. So my reference here would be St. Paul, the Christian, who, when he was discussing issues with the Greeks, in fact, tried to locate some image, some word, some deity, and so on. And it was the unnamed God, and is what he did, and so on. So I think rather than answer the question, I would suggest that to deal with the question involves a lot of hard work and homework on your part, our part, to be able to talk to some others. I have an advantage here over some of you. I've been married 3 times. And, I find that while it is the case that culture, the minimal unit of culture is the given individual, the minimal unit of intercultural miscommunication is spousehood, I think. In other words, that's not what I meant. One of the people from Georgetown.
Well, that notion invariably is what catapulted Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus to the #1 bookseller.
Right. And Deborah Tannen, I had her in mind from Georgetown, where she talks about, that's not what I said.